Ballerinas Across the Andes, or The Great Ecstasy of Werner H. by Owen Booth. We lost the first girl before we even got on the boat. We'd been stuck out on the Argentinian pampas for a week, waiting for the steamer that was going to take us up the river. We spent our day sitting on the hotel porch drinking pisco sours and staring into the vast landscape as the ballerinas smoked cigarettes and told obscene Russian folk tales. It was Svetlana who bolted, of course. Gloomy, nervous Svetlana with her pale, wheat-coloured eyes full of the Ukrainian steppe. Maybe something out in all that immensity reminded her of home. Her note said she'd run away with one of the local capybara herders. We never saw her again. She was one of the lucky ones. It was the early 1980s, the age of miracles, and Werner H. was the world's second most famous German film director. He was the man who had persuaded 500 death row prisoners to act in a full musical version of The Sinking of the Titanic. Who had wrestled a dolphin to death for a film about environmental destruction. Who declared, "The universe is absurd. My role is only to try to challenge that absurdity." For his latest film, he was attempting to transport a troupe of Russian ballerinas over the Argentinian Andes into Chile, on foot, at the height of military tension between the two countries. It would be a sort of sequel to his earlier hit, Across the Alps with Midgets. Nobody was sure where he got the ballerinas from. The rumour was that he'd won them in a game of poker with the East German ambassador. Whatever the truth of it, by the time we'd reached the foothills, we were already down 2 more girls. One taken by giant otters during the 5-day jungle riverboat journey, the other killed by a poisoned arrow, and the rest of the company were starting to get nervous. "I appreciate artistic intention," said Ludmilla, as we loaded up the llamas in the shadow of the 12,000-foot peaks. "I am just not convinced by aesthetic and social value." On balance. Ludmilla was the prima ballerina and de facto leader of the troupe. She smoked more than any human being I have ever met. "You are a writer," she said. "You know about these things." I wasn't really a writer. I just answered a job ad at film school. Script assistant needed, incredibly dangerous project, orphan preferred. And here I was, loading film canisters onto a herd of llamas named after the 1978 World Cup winning Argentinian football team. "I'm not sure you can necessarily put a value on works of art," I said, patting Ricky Villa the llama on the shoulder. I was beginning to suspect I was in love with Ludmilla. Ludmilla with her sturdy Siberian knees and magnificent cheekbones of the people. Ludmilla, whose beauty could have launched 1,000 tractor factories. Was all she replied. Hector the llama herder drank his mate and kept his counsel. It took us 3 weeks of slow climbing to reach the 15,000-foot high Juanita Pass. The weather was terrible, and we lost 4 more girls and 2 guides on the way. Our director was living up to his formidable reputation by throwing daily tantrums whenever the climate, or the light, or another death came between him and his vision. "These mountains are an obscenity!" he screamed into the wind. "They are the geological manifestation of moral terror. Nature is a dog that keeps returning to its vomit." And so on. Nevertheless, it was clear that he was getting some spectacular footage as the ballerinas battled against the elements. There was no script as such. Every evening, H and his ancient cameraman Dieter planned the next day's shots, while the rest of us sat round the fire eating roast guinea pig. Peter had been with H for 25 years. One afternoon, as we paused between shots, I asked him why. "Better to follow the dream of a madman than no dream at all," he said. As for the Ballerinas, I couldn't help thinking Moscow was probably glad to see the back of them. For all their beauty and talent, they were a demanding, surly bunch. They missed their mothers, and vodka, and good shoes, and the magnificent Moscow subway, and they made sure everyone knew it. Also, Ludmilla kept sleeping with me every few days when she was feeling homesick, leaving me thoroughly confused. One morning, I came across H as I was returning from a surreptitious visit to Ludmilla's tent. It was a few minutes before dawn, and he was tracking the flight of a huge condor through the telescopic sight of an antique German army rifle. "Would it be a sin to shoot it, you think?" he said, as we watched the bird soaring against the dead white of the mountaintops. "Would that finally get God's attention?" I said I wasn't sure. He blinked and lowered the rifle, as if noticing me for the first time. The condor floated away into the half-light. 300 years ago, travellers crossing the Alps wore blindfolds to avoid being driven mad by the sight of the ungodly sights, he told me. Now we must adopt their methods. Until the next day, blindfolds were issued to the entire crew. By sunset, we'd lost another guide, 2 more girls, and 3 llamas. Now, if you want to cross from Argentina into Chile without worrying about things like military checkpoints, passports, visas, and filming permits, the only route is over the O'Higgins Glacier. Then you have an easy path down to the tree line and then along the old Inca paths to the foothills and the coast. Only problem is, no one has ever made it across the O'Higgins alive. It's 3 miles wide and 30 long. It's a frozen sea of jumbled, jagged ice and hidden crevices. 100-mile-an-hour winds howl down its length from the 20,000-foot peaks of Mount Mert above. At night, its unfathomable depths are said to sing with the souls of the dead. Entire brigade of Chilean army lost down there in 1972, said Ludmilla, as our party considered the horrifying spectacle at dusk. Also planes. We've been struggling to get this far for the best part of a month. Altitude sickness, exposures, rock falls, lightning strikes, blizzards, snow blindness and suicidal depression had thinned our numbers considerably. For H, it was now a battle of wills. Whatever demons he'd come here to face, they proved themselves worthy adversaries. He started every day by screaming quotations from Nietzsche in the mountains. He filmed the exhausted ballerinas performing lectures on the sublime as they waded through the waist-deep snowdrifts. He declared himself disgusted with the universe. When we spotted the avalanche rolling down the valley towards us as we made camp that evening, no one was very much surprised. That night we slept under the brilliant frozen stars. After the last survivor had been dug from the snow, there were 11 of us left. The tents were gone, along with Irina, Yolana, the 3 Tanyas, and the last of our guides. We had 2 llamas and a week's worth of food between us. Lying next to me in the sleeping bag, Ludmilla smoked furiously and stared at the Milky Way. I told her I'd never seen such a huge sky before. You people see nothing that is not in your own image, she said bluntly. Everything speaks to you of yourselves. In the morning, Hector, the llama herder, had disappeared, taking the last of our provisions. He left us poor Ricky Villa, weighed down with film cans, while H climbed a low ridge behind the camp to survey the route across the glacier. we held an emergency meeting without him. The situation was impossible. We all agreed. We'd all given everything. There was no shame in turning around now. Finally, Dieter spoke. Loyal, beautiful Dieter, who had followed H across deserts and through jungles, into combat again and again, and never once complained. Dieter, who had given half a lifetime in the service of H's vision. "We go back," he said. There was a crack of gunshot and the sound of a bullet ricocheting off rock. We all looked. H was 50 feet away, aiming his rifle squarely at Dieter. "We don't go back," he shouted. It was a disaster, of course. Within 2 hours, we were hopelessly lost among huge ice boulders and 1,000-foot-deep crevasses, with no way of retreat, even if H had allowed it. By that point, Masha and Katya had already fallen to their deaths. Little Natalia followed shortly after. We spent 8 days wandering through that monstrous maze while the weather threw everything it had at us. We sucked snow for moisture. We slept huddled together in soaked, frozen sleeping bags. We lost poor sweet Martha to hypothermia, and beautiful Oksana to a reoccurrence of malaria that, ironically, she picked up on the pampas. Galina got frostbite on her toes that turned into gangrene. Unwilling to accept a life without dancing, she bravely hobbled out into the snow one night while the rest of us slept. Then there was only 4 of us left. H kept on filming. He directed Dieter to shoot roll after roll of Ludmilla and I stumbling through the snow. To stop Ricky Villa from walking away in the dark, he tied himself to the beast, running a rope from Ricky's halter to his right ankle. During the day, they shuffled along together like the last surviving members of a chain gang. "Only in the immeasurableness of nature can we find our own limitations," H insisted. "And only then can we discover our preeminence over them." And then, on the 7th day, a snow bridge gave way, and Dieter was taken from us. And with him, the camera. H knelt down in the snow and wept. Embarrassed, I bowed my head. Even now, as much as I hated myself for it, I couldn't help feeling that Paul somehow let him down. "Every victory is denied to me," he cried, tearing at his hair. "Fortune spits in my face. Nature conspires with fate to insult me. I am cursed by God to wander the earth eternally thwarted." At that, noble Ricky Villa, startled by the outburst, or just exhausted with it all, suddenly reared up and threw himself into the crevasse. It took H about 3 seconds to realise he was doomed. He looked down at the rope around his ankle, back at us, and opened his mouth. "Hi!" he said. And then he was gone. Ludmilla and I stood at the edge of the crevasse, looking down into the brilliant blue depths for a while. "Und wenn du lange in einer Abgrund blickst," she said finally. "What does that mean?" I said. She took a drag from a cigarette and then flicked it into the abyss. We watched it tumble away from us. "You stare into glacier too long," she said. "Eventually, glacier stare back." A week later, so the story goes, 2 people walked out of the mountains near the Chilean border town of Maldonado. Foreigners, a man and a woman. They went into the first bar they found and started drinking. They didn't stop for 3 days. And then, they disappeared. It takes 30 years, they say, give or take, for the glacier to give up its secrets. 30 years for a wrecked plane, or a camera, or a llama, or a man to make the journey from below the shadow of the mountain to the glacier front. Needless to say, I've recently started paying careful attention to international news. See, I've got this great idea for a new film. All I need is some ballerinas.